Daniel Carter used to believe that life followed a simple rule. If you worked hard and loved honestly, things would eventually make sense. That belief began to crumble the year his mother died. He was 27 when he stood alone in the narrow cemetery outside Manchester, rain soaking through his black coat, mud clinging to his shoes like it wanted to pull him down into the ground with her. There were no dramatic cries, no collapsing to his knees, only a quiet, suffocating emptiness that wrapped itself around his chest and refused to let go. His mother, Helen Carter, had been his entire world. They had lived alone together since Daniel was 10, since the night his father walked out with a suitcase and never came back. Helen never spoke badly of him. She simply worked harder, slept less, and loved Daniel enough for 2 parents. When she died of a sudden heart failure, Daniel felt as if the last light in his life had been switched off. After the funeral, the house felt wrong, too quiet, too still. Every object carried her absence like a wound: the cup she used every morning, the cardigan still hanging behind the door, the smell of her lavender soap lingering in the bathroom. Daniel stopped cooking proper meals. He stopped answering calls. Days blended into nights as he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to memories echo in his mind. Grief did not arrive as tears. It arrived as exhaustion. 3 months later, Daniel lost his job. He worked as a junior accountant at a small firm, and though his boss tried to be understanding, mistakes began to pile up. Numbers blurred on the screen. Deadlines were missed. One quiet Friday afternoon, Daniel was called into the office and told it was nothing personal. Walking home that day, he felt something inside him break, not loudly, but permanently. Without work, without family, and without purpose, Daniel began to disappear from his own life. Across the city, Emily Rhodes was learning how lonely a crowded world could be. At 32, she had everything people admired: a stable job as a hospital nurse, a small but cozy flat, and a calm, composed personality that made others trust her easily. But behind closed doors, Emily carried a grief of her own. 2 years earlier, she had lost her son. No one ever really knew how to talk to a woman who had buried her child. Friends became careful, conversations shortened, invitations stopped coming. Emily returned to work 6 months after the accident. She smiled when required, spoke gently to patients, and performed her duties with mechanical perfection. At night, she sat by the window and replayed the same question over and over again. Why him? Her marriage did not survive the loss. Her husband, Mark, drowned his pain in silence and late nights. Emily drowned hers in memories. They slowly became strangers, sharing the same grief, but speaking different emotional languages. The divorce was quiet and mutual, almost polite. After that, Emily told herself she was fine alone. She wasn't. Daniel and Emily met on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the most ordinary place imaginable, a bus stop. It was raining lightly, the kind of rain that soaked into your bones without you noticing. Daniel sat on the bench, staring at the ground, his hood pulled low. Emily stood a few steps away, holding her bag tightly, her thoughts drifting after a long hospital shift. The bus was late. When it finally arrived, Daniel stood up too quickly and dropped the envelope he was holding. Papers scattered onto the wet pavement. Without hesitation, Emily knelt down to help him gather them. "Careful," she said softly. "They're getting wet." Daniel looked at her for the first time. Her voice was calm, warm, unfamiliar in a world that had felt cold for too long. "Thank you," he muttered. As she handed the papers back, she noticed the heading on one of them, "Final Notice." She didn't comment. She simply smiled gently and boarded the bus. Daniel watched her walk away, feeling something inside him stir, something dangerously close to hope. He hated that feeling. That night, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the man at the bus stop. There was a sadness in his eyes she recognized too well, the kind that came from loss, not disappointment. Daniel, meanwhile, sat at his kitchen table, staring at the same papers. For the first time in months, he felt the urge to talk to someone. Anyone. But the silence answered back. And so 2 broken lives continued separately, unaware that fate had already placed them on the same path, one that would test their pain, their love, and their will to survive the weight of silent days.
Daniel avoided the bus stop for 3 days. It wasn't that he feared seeing the woman again, Emily, but rather that he feared not seeing her. Hope had become a dangerous thing. It crept in quietly and hurt the most when it disappeared. On the 4th day, he forced himself to go. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement dark and reflective. Daniel sat on the same bench, his hands trembling slightly as he checked the time. He told himself it meant nothing if she didn't come. She did. Emily recognized him instantly. He was sitting exactly the same way, shoulders hunched, eyes distant. This time, instead of standing apart, she sat beside him. "Hi," she said. Daniel swallowed. "Hi." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was familiar, like 2 people who understood that words weren't always necessary. "I'm Emily," she said finally. "Daniel." Another pause. "You looked like you were carrying a lot the other day," Emily said carefully. "I hope that doesn't sound rude." Daniel gave a small, humorless smile. "No, it's accurate." The bus arrived, but neither of them moved. They talked the entire ride, about small things at first, work, the weather, how unpredictable buses were. When Daniel got off, Emily surprised herself by saying, "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" Daniel hesitated. Every instinct told him to say no, but loneliness was louder. "Yeah," he said, "I would." Coffee turned into routine. They met once a week, then twice. Sometimes they spoke for hours. Sometimes they sat quietly, sharing space instead of stories. One evening, Daniel broke. They were sitting in a small cafe when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence, his hands clenched around his cup. "My mother died." Emily didn't interrupt. She didn't offer comfort too quickly. "She was everything," Daniel continued, "and when she was gone, everything else just collapsed." His voice cracked, and for the first time since the funeral, tears fell freely. Emily reached across the table and held his hand. "My son died," she said softly. Daniel froze. He was 6, a car accident. One moment he was laughing, the next he was gone. The cafe noise faded into the background. 2 lives paused in shared grief. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered. "So am I," Emily replied. From that moment on, something fragile but powerful formed between them. Not love yet, but understanding. Months passed. Daniel found part-time work. Emily began sleeping through the night. They helped each other breathe again. Eventually, affection grew into something deeper. They never rushed it. Pain had taught them patience. Daniel moved into Emily's flat one cold winter morning, carrying only 2 suitcases and years of emotional baggage. For a while, life felt almost kind. Almost. The nightmare started first. Daniel would wake up gasping, his mother's voice echoing in his head. Emily would hold him until morning. Then Emily's nightmares returned too, her son calling for her, always just out of reach. They tried to be strong for each other. Sometimes strength wasn't enough. One evening, Emily found an unopened letter on the table. Daniel hadn't mentioned it. "Final notice?" Emily asked quietly. Daniel looked away. I didn't want to worry you. We're a team, or I thought we were. The words cut deeper than she intended. Arguments followed, not loud but heavy. Silence filled the spaces where laughter once lived. Daniel felt like a burden. Emily felt like she was losing him. The breaking point came on a rainy night. Daniel had lost his job again. He didn't tell Emily. Instead, he sat alone at a bar, drowning his failure in cheap whiskey. When Emily came home to an empty flat and unanswered calls, panic consumed her. When Daniel finally returned, drunk and distant, she couldn't hold it in anymore. I can't lose you too. I've already lost enough. Daniel looked at her, eyes hollow. You'd be better off without me. That's not true. But it feels true, he whispered. Those words lingered like a curse. 2 days later, Daniel packed his bags. I need to fix myself before I destroy us. Emily wanted to beg him to stay. She let him go. Weeks passed, then months. Emily returned to silence. Daniel sank deeper into his own. They both wondered if love was enough or if pain always demanded more. Daniel left without a destination. He slept on friends' couches at first, then in cheap hostels, and finally in places that asked no questions. The city felt larger and colder when you no longer belonged anywhere. Each morning he woke up with the same weight on his chest, the knowledge that he had walked away from the only person who had ever truly seen him. He told himself it was necessary. Healing, he believed, had to be done alone. But loneliness was not healing. It was erosion. Daniel stopped answering Emily's messages after the first month, not because he didn't care, but because every word reminded him of what he had lost. Shame wrapped itself around him tighter than grief ever had. One night he stood on a bridge overlooking the river. The water below moved endlessly, uncaring. He wondered how many people had stood in that exact spot asking the same question: how much pain is too much? He didn't jump, but the thought stayed with him. Emily tried to move forward. She worked longer shifts. She filled her evenings with noise, television, music, anything to avoid the quiet. Yet every corner of the flat carried Daniel's absence, just as it once carried her son's. Loss, she realized, never truly left. It only changed shape. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, she found a drawing. Her son's handwriting was uneven, the colors bright and careless. At the bottom, he had written, "For Mom, so you won't be sad." Emily collapsed onto the floor and cried until there were no tears left. That night, she wrote Daniel a letter, not to blame him, not to beg, just to tell the truth. She wrote about her son, about fear, about how surviving didn't mean forgetting, and loving didn't mean replacing what was lost. She mailed it without expecting a reply. The letter reached Daniel 2 weeks later. He read it standing in a narrow hallway, his hands shaking. With every line, something inside him cracked open, not pain, but recognition. He had believed leaving was an act of protection. He had been wrong. Daniel checked himself into a small mental health clinic the next morning. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heroic. It was necessary. Therapy was brutal. It stripped away excuses and forced him to face the truth. Grief shared is lighter than grief carried alone. When Daniel was discharged months later, he didn't feel fixed. He felt alive. Emily opened the door to find him standing there, thinner, older, but steadier. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know I finally learned how to stay." Emily studied his face for a long moment. "Come in," she said. They didn't rush back into love. They moved slowly, carefully, like people rebuilding after a storm. Some days were still heavy, some nights were still quiet, but they faced them together. Years later, they stood at a small grave and placed fresh flowers. "My mother," Daniel whispered.
"And my son," Emily replied. They held hands. Life had not given them happiness without cost. It had given them survival. And sometimes that was enough.